Hello again. This is Chris Shepard, the music director of CONCORA, welcoming you to the third Motet Monday, where I talk about the next in our series of 6 Bach motets. Today is a big one. It is Jesu, meine Freude, the 11-movement motet written for 5-part choir. So not double choir, as we have seen in Sing it dem Herrn, not 4-part choir, as we saw in Lobet dem Herrn, but 5-part, SSATB, which is a fairly rare designation for Bach. The B minor Mass has a great deal of SSATB. The Bach Magnificat is also 5-part, but by and large, you don't see that very often. Now, there is so much, as you might imagine, in this motet that I'm going to do something that is a little bit different. I'm not going to talk very much about the musical material as we go through the motet, but rather I want to talk about the structure of it, because the structure and the way that Bach has laid this out so purposefully can be missed when you are just a casual listener, or in this case, a casual observer. A side note, many of you watching this know Rick Coffey very well, Richard Coffey, who was the founding conductor of CONCORA. I was thrilled, though not at all surprised, to get an email from Rick, who is always so kind about what we are doing these days. And he noticed straight away that I used the possibility of video, all that is inherent in that, which is different from a live concert, to try to bring out those structural edifices, that building that Bach created. And I'll explain how I did that as I go through, so that when you watch it, you will have that in mind. Let me show you something that's very, and I should say straight away, by the way, for this one, I'm going back and forth an awful lot between different programs on the computer. There's sound, and I have to jump in the score. So just please be patient with me, and I'll try not to get too anxious. I will try to keep your attention as I find all these different cuts. Let me begin by saying this. For the Lutheran, there was nothing more important than the cross. This is often referred to as the theology of the cross. And though I do have to talk about theology today, without theology, Jesu, meine Freude makes absolutely no sense. I will try not to get too bogged down in it. But I want to begin by saying how important that shape is, because the idea for the Lutheran is not just that Jesus died on the cross, but that the believer must also reenact that in the analogy of faith on a daily basis as he or she lays down his or her own life. And that concept is so embedded in the chorale that is the basis of this motet that it's really important to know that. Now, if you look at the screen, look at this shape. Can you imagine a long vertical bar and a long horizontal bar? So here's one bar, 4 and 8 is another, 3 and 9 is another. You see what I mean? But put the vertical 1 through 6. You will see that this is patterned on a cruciform, crux meaning cross, a cruciform shape. Bach uses this in a number of ways throughout his career to make a theological point. Christ lag in Todesbanden, BWV 4, from very, very early in his career, that is set up around a central, and this is the important thing, around a central movement, in this case, movement 6. And then on either side of those, he has pairs of movements that are the same. So for example, 1 and 11, the first and last, the alpha and omega, if you will, are both chorales. 2 and 10, both from the letter to the Romans. Now, I'm going to come back to make that point, but I want to take a moment now and tell you what that means when I talk about the chorale versus Romans, so that we can build this structure together. The 6 of the 11 movements in this motet are based on a chorale, very famous Kruger chorale. which would have been instantly recognizable to a Lutheran congregation. I should tell you, if you hear any rattling, it's raining here at my house today while I record this, and I think that's perfect because we would often associate, as with so many of the motets, we don't know for sure, but we would associate this motet very possibly with a funeral, because the whole concept of this chorale, of the text of this hymn, is about laying down one's life and embracing death out of the love out of our love for Jesus. For example, let me just read the translation from the opening movement. There won't be time for me to do all of the translations. You can find all of this online, but this gives you some sense. Jesus, my joy, my heart's pasture, Jesus, my treasure. How long has my heart suffered and longed for you? God's Lamb, my bridegroom, besides you on earth, nothing shall be dear to me. So it's that idea of Jesus, the greatest treasure. It is, in a way, a love song. So that chorale appears in 6 movements. Let's go back to that cruciform shape so that I can show you that and remind you. So 1 and 11, 3 and 9, 5 and 7. Those are pairs on either side of that central vertical beam. Now, just a little bit of a sidebar here. When I did my master's recital, I conducted Buxtehude, the great, you could say, mentor to Bach. He wasn't really his teacher, but Bach really admired him and traveled to see him. I conducted Buxtehude's setting of Jesu, meine Freude. And he also sets it up in a slightly cruciform way, but he only uses the verses of the hymn. We don't know for sure whether Bach knew that version. There are certainly some similarities, but then again, a chorale is a chorale, and so there would be some similarities. But the genius of what Bach does is that he intersperses between those 6 chorale verses, he intersperses lines from the 8th chapter of the letter to the Romans. Now, any of you who are into theology and know much about the Bible know that Romans is a very, very densely theological epistle. And I'm not qualified, nor do we have the time for me to get too much into that. But can we go to this verse 9? Because this is really important, because this is that vertical beam. It's quite a long movement. It's a very sophisticated contrapuntal movement that Bach puts at the center of the cross. And this is what it says. It's in bold here. But you are not in the flesh. You are in the Spirit, if in fact the Spirit of God dwells in you. So you can imagine that Bach chose this because this longing for Jesus means leaving behind earthly things and embracing heavenly things. So it's Bach's way of saying, but listen, you don't need to worry about this because you're not of the flesh, you are of the Spirit. So it pulls together that idea. And then there's, as is so often in all Christian theology, we will sometimes paper over this, but the Lutherans never paper over this. There is a sting in the tail. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. So there's always just that little bit of an ouch. Now, I'm not going to go through these 5 verses from Romans, but they all suggest the same thing. They're all about the same idea that if you belong to God, then you are of the Spirit. And so you don't need to be dragged down by flesh. And we'll see in a moment the way that different movements from this motet really accentuate that. So let's take a second and let's jump from chorale to chorale to chorale. Let's look at those chorale movements. Most of the time, they are like a hymn with the choir singing in block chords. So 2 of them are not like that, and they're really quite extraordinary, and we will see the way that is true. So here is where you need to be patient, because I need to flip through the score so you can see and get to the right place in the recording. Again, the quality may not be good on your computer for this, but when you go to the video, it will be much better. Let's take a second. We're going to listen to the entire first movement so you can hear the whole chorale, because it's really quite important that you know it. So here it is, the first movement of Jesu, meine Freude. That repeats, as so often happens in Lutheran chorales, that the first phrase repeats. Final phrase, it's always beautiful, this. And it's such a simple, it's just a scale down, isn't it? That last phrase, but Bach always does something to resolve any of the tension that may have arisen in the verse. For example, so now we're going to go to the next chorale. Let me just again make the point that he goes every other, 1 is a chorale, 2 Romans, 3 is a chorale, 4 Romans. And what we're doing now is we are jumping 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. So you can compare out of order how he handles the different chorales. So the chorale verses. This next verse is saying Satan can do whatever he wants, but you, Jesus, my joy, will be there for me. So let me get this. This is the 3rd verse. And occasionally I'll bleed the end of one. It's very hard to catch them. So just straightforward chorale verse here. It's already more active. But it's immediately recognizable as that chorale tune, isn't it? Now, I'm going to skip 5. We're going to come back to 5, and you will see why in a moment. Let me find it here, and let me find the timing over here. We're going to go to 7. So this is another chorale setting. Again, I'll bleed in. And this is even more tense. It's saying, away with all treasures. But you hear the melody on top, right? So weg, W-E-G, and the G sounds like a K in German. Weg, 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 weg. There's a chorus in the St. John Passion that uses that word to great effect. And the same thing here, the text is, away with all treasures, away you vain honors. You are rejecting the things of the world, the things of the flesh. Weg, weg. So that's 7. We skipped 5, but 1, 3, 7 all sound generally like that chorale that happens all together. Now let's skip 9, we'll come back to that, and go to 11, which is the very last movement. And it is the movement that essentially everything is now at peace. Saying, though I endure mockery and shame here, nevertheless you stay with me, even in sorrow. Jesus, my joy. Let me go to the end of the score. And this, by the way, is the same harmonization as the first movement. So when we talk about that cruciform and having all those pairs around that central bar, it's important that the first and last, the alpha and omega, have that similarity. So you recognize it, isn't that? It just has a real sense of release and relief at the very end. Let's go back to our cruciform structure, just so I can remind you what we've done. We looked at 1, 3, skipped 5, 7, skipped 9, and 11. Now, all of those chorales, all the odd numbered movements are based on the chorale. Those 4 are very straightforward. The other 2 are a little bit different, and in ways that really just yet again show the genius of Bach. Let's go back to 9 first. This is one of the most beautiful movements that Bach ever wrote. Everybody loves this. So let's look at this score here. First of all, it's a very odd scoring. There's no bass. There's no bass here. It's soprano, soprano, alto, and tenor. Now they have different roles. As you can see, the 2 soprano parts move together. So they go through like that, like a melody. I don't really want to call it a melody, and you'll see why in a second, but let's call it the melody. And they're often in thirds. The tenor acts like a bass part, like a continuo part. And it's a walking bass part. That, by the way, just in case you care about this sort of thing, is called a bassetto, which just means little bass. When Bach uses tenor in a roll of a bass, it is called bassetto, and it's a different color because it's a little bit higher, right? It's not rocket science, and it makes sense. But what is really extraordinary about this movement, if you look here and you see this bit that the altos sing, they sing the chorale tune. So it begins, so we call this a chorale fantasia, and Bach was famous for them. And it begins in such a way that it seems to have no relation to the chorale tune, and then they come in. In the video, I separated the altos entirely. It's sort of imagined, and Bach would do this from time to time, that he would use there's a balcony that was called the sparrow balcony. And for example, in the beginning of the St. Matthew Passion, he put his trebles up there. So I just wanted to get a little bit of distance and make them so important. Let's just listen to the beginning of this. So it's still the chorale, it's still a setting of the hymn, but he just treats it very differently. Here we go. Then alto. And I love that it is a little bit hidden. I think that Bach does hide it just a little bit in there, which is part of why the visual helps. Then they continue the melody. And you can follow the tune. It just phrase by phrase goes through the whole thing. Now, the other movement, let me see where I am in this. The other movement that is based on a chorale but doesn't really feel it is the Trotz dem alten Drachen. It's a terrific text. Defiance to the old dragon, defiance to the vengeance of death. Defiance, Trotz means defiance. And he sets this in a way that you can't really tell to a large extent that the chorale is in there. It is. I'll show you how after. Let's just listen a little bit. And Bach shifts the rhythm so you're never quite sure where things sit. It's great, and it's everybody's favorite movement to sing, other than Gute Nacht, because it is just so full of energy. But you remember, Jesu, meine Freude. It is buried in there. So it's in there, and then which is in the chorale. Here it is there. So it's in there, but he just embeds it and shifts it around a little bit. So just to remind you, we looked at the odd numbers. Those are all the settings of the chorale. Now, a choice that I made in terms of the recording is I used the full choir for all the chorale settings, so that there would be, at least subliminally, this sense of, okay, these are the pillars that work in this structure. Now, mind you, in Gute Nacht, there are no basses, but I still use the full sections. What I wanted to do differently for the settings of the verses from the letter to the Romans was use part of the choir. And let me tell you why. So the second movement, this is sung by the 5-part choir, and then on the other side of the cross, it's balancing bar, it's balancing beam, is also, and you're going to hear those in a second, very, very similar material. It's shorter the second time, but similar material, also 5 parts. What I did was I used half of the choir for number 2 and the other half of the choir for number 10 as a sort of, and again, it's subliminal and subconscious, but they are there to balance one another. Now for these, let's just listen a little bit. So this is the first one, and I'm not even going to put the score up because you're going to hear immediately what I want you to hear. So here's the beginning of that movement. Sorry, coming out of another. So you hear that? Now let's listen to number 10, which is its balancing movement, other quintet. It's the same thing, right? So by using different forces, I wanted to get just a little bit of a contrast in there. By the way, again, for those of you who know a lot about the Bible, that the first one of the 2 that we heard, this is a very famous verse. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So it has real force, and although it's in a minor key, it's actually quite triumphant. It's quite triumphant. Now, the 2 on the next beam of the Romans, I love this because he sets this up as contrast. They're both trios. We use soloists. Sometimes people use the whole choir. The first one is SSA. We would say a women's trio, but of course he had boys there. So a treble trio. Listen to that. lovely. And it's a little bit like Gute Nacht. The two sopranos have a duet within each other, and then the alto part is more like a continuo part. And then there is a balancing trio. Let me find the time for that. But it's has tenor and bass in it, so it's a different color. Sorry, I'm having trouble catching that. Okay, here we go. Oh, I should say something about this right before you hear it. This is set in 12/8. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3. And it is often associated with Christmas music, like bum ba dum ba da ding dum ba dum ba da dum. And I love it. I love it because the text here from Romans is, but if Christ is in you, although your bodies are dead, your spirits are alive. But the point is, but if Christ is in you, in your flesh, the English word from the Latin is incarnation. And so I think that Bach is referring to Christmas, which was the incarnation. Maybe I'm wrong, but I like the idea because it's such a different movement. It's in a major key and it is very lilting. Very different, right? So let's go back as we always do. Let's go back to our cruciform. We did all the odd numbers, which are the chorales, and now, so we looked at that beam. They're the same notes. It goes on differently later. And then on this beam, we have the two trios. And then so we know that by putting this at the center, this was really important to Bach. And that's what I had said before, that it is that dichotomy of if you are not in the flesh, then you are in the spirit. And we need to turn to it because it's an important movement. We're going to finish here by showing you. So we have a fugue here. And just like any Bach fugue, it unfolds and it's beautiful. We associate fugues with rules or the law. So there is this sense that this is a promise that God has made. And although it is written very strictly according to the rules of the fugue, it is a very beautiful piece of music. So I'm going to let us listen to a little bit of this before we finish up here. And I'll keep the score up so you can see where we go. Okay. Alto. Soprano 1. Bass. And I'm going to leave that there. I know you're going to love it when you get there. And you do have this sense when you come to that movement, it's the longest section, maybe not as long as Gute Nacht, come to think of it because of tempo, but it is a chord. I was very interested when I prepared for this Motet Monday and wrote in the timings, at least according to the tempos that I used, it actually sits right in the center. And so it has that feeling of solidity. So just reminding you, and we'll finish with this cruciform structure. Odd numbers are the chorales. I have the whole choir sing those. The even numbers are those verses from Romans. I have two different halves of the choir sing those. The trios are soloists. And then the linchpin of the whole motet at the center, there I do have the entire choir sing that as well. There's so much more in this piece, and I really ran through it, but there's nothing else to do with the time that we have. I hope that you love this piece. I hope that you enjoy the way that we varied the way that it looked and sounded. And I look forward to seeing you next week for the next installment. Thanks so much.